What's more difficult, Formula 1 or Formula E? Well, I've been lucky enough to drive both Formula 1 and Formula E cars. I've driven F1 cars all the way from the early 80s up to the mid 2010s. And a few weeks ago, I drove a Formula E car for the first time. But how are they different, and which one would be the most challenging to race? Well, my answer might surprise you. Most motorsport fans would say that Formula 1 is the pinnacle of the sport. The fastest cars, the most technology and the best drivers. And some would argue that over the years it's become a shadow of its former self. Clumsy cars, sanitized circuits and too many drivers who pay to be there. Personally, I love Formula 1 and I still watch it even in the boring years. I've suffered through the domination of Schumacher, Vettel, Hamilton and now Verstappen. But as an unbiased F1 fan, I do prefer it when it's not obvious who's going to win. Last year there were 3 winners in F1 across 22 races, with Max winning all but 3. And let's hope that he doesn't beat that this year. Whereas in IndyCar, there were 7 different winners in 17 races. And it's a similar story in Formula E too, where there were 7 winners across 16 races, with a much more balanced distribution of wins. So does having more winners in a series mean it's actually more difficult for the drivers? Well, there's more uncertainty, it's more chaotic, it's more difficult to predict. Surely it's harder for the drivers. Well, maybe, but on the other hand, F1 cars are the fastest. So surely this makes F1 the hardest. Well, I wanted to take a look at the differences between F1 and Formula E to see how things stack up, and to see how things are spiced up in an effort to make racing more interesting for us as fans. And as I've never driven a Formula E car before, I went out to Diriyah to test one, so I could compare it to the numerous F1 cars I've driven, which I'll share later in this video. But first, let's take a look at one thing that really stuck out to me when I drove the car: the circuit. The Diriyah circuit was like nothing I've driven before. The closest I'd actually come was years ago when I raced in Baku. This was before they'd run an actual Grand Prix there, and that circuit was pretty interesting. That wasn't me, by the way. In Formula E, 9 of the 16 races are held on street circuits, but there are now actually more traditional road courses on the calendar than ever before. But of the street circuits that remain, they're incredibly challenging. The street circuits in Formula E are proper street circuits, tracks that are actually normal roads. This is like Monaco is in F1, but unlike most of the other so-called street circuits. And where I drove, in Diriyah, was a good example of a proper street circuit. Now, I could tell you how exciting and fast the track was, but it's best if you just watch this. The thing that stood out to me was not only how much fun this first section was, but also, from a driver's perspective, just how little runoff there was. And from my perspective, that's not really a safety concern, but it is so much more challenging as a driver. It's so easy to make a mistake. The worry here for a driver is damaging the car and missing vital track time. Track time missed means less confidence in the circuit and getting close to those walls, and then less time available to change setup and make your car faster, while everyone else is doing exactly that. On this entire circuit, which is 2.5 kilometers long, there's only one corner with any kind of runoff, and that's here at turn 18. So what does that mean as a driver? Well, take a look at this famous sequence of corners, Eau Rouge and Radion. This is what they used to look like, and this is what they look like today. Now take a look at Copse at Silverstone. This is what it used to look like, and this is what it looks like today. And there's absolutely no doubt a driver's mentality changes when there's asphalt on the outside of a corner. And please understand me here, I think safety is the most important thing when racing. But what I'm discussing here is the challenge for the driver. If there's asphalt runoff, the driver approaches practice completely differently. We see it in F1 all the time. In the first free practice session, we'll see drivers running deep at the end of a big braking zone through a chicane, or they get too much oversteer in a quick corner and run wide. No harm done. But when there's no runoff, a driver changes their behaviour. And again, it's not because they're worried about crashing. That actually rarely comes into a driver's mind. But running off the track and potentially getting damaged means less practice time and being on the back foot compared to your competitors. So with no runoff, the driver has to build up to the limit more gradually. They have to minimise the risk of crashing. And that takes more skill. It's simply harder. Having bigger consequences in terms of losing practice time highlights the more skilled drivers. And that's not to mention the walls. having a wall close to you at 160 miles per hour does focus the mind. And where runoff areas typically help drivers be braver on the brakes, walls make drivers more careful not only when slowing, but also when accelerating out of the corner. And you might be thinking, well, F1 has loads of street circuits now. And yes, they do. Officially, that's Australia, Baku, Monaco, Montreal, Jeddah, Vegas, Singapore, and Miami. However, most of these aren't proper street circuits. To be honest, there are only a couple that we can genuinely call a proper street track. Right then, getting fast on a tricky circuit is a challenge, but it's easy if you have loads of practice time, right? Well, there's also a fair few differences between F1 and Formula E in terms of how the weekend is set up. At most F1 weekends, drivers and teams have 3 one-hour practice sessions before they head into qualifying. During this time, the teams sort out their car setup, understand tyre performance, and calculate fuel consumption. And that's a big list of things to get done. But take that time away, as we see during sprint weekends, and things get a bit mixed up. With less time on track, the drivers have less time to figure out the circuit, and engineers have less time to find the perfect setup. And to be honest, I really like this. I think it's a good way to add some uncertainty to the entire weekend. And this is something that Formula E does really well. A typical race weekend will have 2 practice sessions of 30 minutes each. And that's not a lot of time to get up to speed and find a setup, especially on a challenging street circuit. Another huge thing I noticed when driving at Diriyah was the track evolution. For example, between free practice 1 and qualifying, which in total was just an hour and a half of running, the circuit improved by about 12 seconds. And that's not because the drivers were getting quicker. That's a calculation of pure circuit evolution. Granted, Diriyah is a bit of an exception. There's a lot of sand around and that makes the circuit extremely slippery, as I experienced, but more on that later. But the challenge is that the circuit is evolving so quickly, and so the goalposts are constantly moving. Braking points are shifting, cornering speeds are increasing, and as a driver, it's difficult to understand exactly what's making the difference to lap time. The driving, the setup, or just the circuit getting grippier. This in turn makes it more difficult to decide on a particular setup direction or a different racing line because everything else is changing. And it's interesting to look at how drivers are challenged during Formula E qualifying as well. For a driver, having to jump in a car and perform over just a single lap without any warm-up time is the most difficult thing. When you have to perform without a sighter lap, you don't have any references of where to brake, how much cornering grip there is, and how hard you can accelerate. But to be fair, F1 now does a decent job here, especially when you compare it to how it used to run, which was 2 hour-long sessions where the single best lap time was pole position. This meant that drivers had stacks of time to get into the groove, get the car setup sorted, and then make multiple attempts at the perfect lap. But now, of course, we have Q1, Q2 and Q3, with elimination in each session, adding some excitement for us viewers. However, drivers will still usually complete 2 runs in each session, giving themselves an opportunity to set a banker lap first. Formula E takes a different approach, which might seem a little bit complicated at first, but really isn't. First, the grid is split up into 2 groups for a 10-minute session each. From here, the top 4 from each session go into the duel stage, where 2 drivers at a time compete through quarterfinals, semi-finals, and a final duel where pole position is decided. The first group stage is similar to a quali session in F1, 10 or so minutes to set your best lap. But during the duels, the drivers have to perform over a single lap, which is incredibly difficult. Push too little and your competitor will simply beat you. Push too hard and you might end up in the wall. But that's not all. There's even more change. Between the group and the dual stages, the car's power increases from 300 to 350 kilowatts. That's an increase of 17%. That means that the top speeds of the cars changes significantly and therefore the braking points for each corner. So the circuit is constantly evolving and the power of the car increases dramatically. And this means that the drivers need to rely more on feel and skill than braking at a particular reference point, because of course that will have moved. With all of this change, it's a big challenge for the drivers to extract the very most from the Formula E cars, and it's a recipe for making mistakes. And so it adds quite a lot of variety to the grids, which is a good thing. So, on to the cars. And as I was lucky enough to drive a Formula E car in Diriyah, I wanted to share with you what that experience was like. That was one of the most fun experiences I've ever had in a race car. It doesn't have very much grip, and it's got a load of torque and power. So you're coming off the corners and the thing's just lighting itself up. It's sliding everywhere. First, the stats of a Formula E car. Its maximum power is 350 kilowatts, which is about 470 horsepower. It weighs 840 kilograms, which is a bit heavier than an F1 car, and they run on treaded tyres. But the most striking difference is the grip to power ratio. The car has a good amount of power and torque, but not that much grip, which means it's fun to drive. As you can see, Formula E cars don't have much of a front wing, or much of a rear wing either, but they do have a pretty big diffuser, which does mean some downforce. But with most of that coming from the floor, it means the car is less affected by following other cars closely, which again is good for racing. So, how difficult is the Formula E to drive, and is it more difficult than F1? Well, first, I think it's worth pointing out that I don't think the difficulty of driving a particular car is a very good measure for any series. Yes, an F1 car is more difficult to drive than an F4 car, but for different reasons, a Haas F1 car is more difficult to drive than a Red Bull F1 car. In the Haas, it's going to be more challenging to predict what the car is going to do. That being said, I felt pretty comfortable in the Formula E car from the get-go. Unsurprisingly, it drove and felt like many of the other racing cars that I've driven. However, the weirdest thing was the lack of engine noise. And I spoke to all of the Formula E drivers before this session, and they said that was going to be the weirdest thing, which it was. And over my first few laps, the circuit was definitely the most challenging thing. I'd not had time to drive the track in the simulator, so I was going in pretty blind, apart from watching about 200 laps of onboard videos just before I jumped in. All my racing driver excuses, that's it, they're out. And I was the first car out on the track that weekend. And due to the sand, it was incredibly slippery. Didn't realize when I wrote this that I was making so many excuses. That meant I was being very cautious on the brakes. Brake a meter too late and there's nothing you can do to stop a shunt. So it's better to brake a bit early and then get a sense of the grip levels through turning and acceleration. And to be honest, the car felt great. Of course, it's not as quick as a Formula 1 car, but because of the power and the relative lack of grip, it was incredibly fun. And it's important to say here that the fun level of a race car isn't really derived from the speed. For me, having fun in a race car is when I extract the most speed possible from it and have a good wheel-to-wheel race. And one of the best things about the Formula E car is that it moves around a lot. You can allow it to slide and still not lose too much time. And the tyres have a hard compound, meaning that you don't need to be gentle with them. And as they're treaded, you can actually have a decent slide with them and not lose too much time. That's why when you watch Formula E on board, the drivers work the wheel a lot more than you'd see in F1. But the weirdest thing is that even though the car is electric, the way it drove and the circuit I was driving on felt much more old school. The car feels much more manual. You can wrestle it around the circuit, more like a high-powered Formula Ford or a historic Formula 1 car. And the circuit was bumpy, with close walls and no runoff. And that is a lot of fun. But was it more difficult to drive than an F1 car? Well, in short, no. F1 cars are faster, have more aero, and a smaller window in which the car can slide before you go off. Not to mention how the tyres degrade and many other complexities. But the fact that driving Formula E is a bit easier is one of the reasons the field is much closer and much more varied than F1. And Formula E is more challenging in some areas, as I mentioned before. There's no doubt they're doing a good job in creating close wheel-to-wheel racing and challenging drivers so much that it's easy for them to make mistakes. And as a fan of motorsport, that's what I want to watch. Racing where I don't know who's going to win. Formula E drivers have to be more aggressive than most. I made a video explaining why up here. Please consider subscribing and I'll see you next time.